The envelope had been sitting in Daniel Brooks's desk drawer for 14 months, sealed in thick cream paper bound with a rubber band that had already begun to crack at the edges. Robert Harrison had handed it to him on a Tuesday afternoon, right after his second diagnosis, right before the conversation that would change the shape of everything his family believed about his oldest daughter. Daniel had promised to keep it until the right moment. He had kept that promise even when it cost him more than he had expected. The right moment, it turned out, would arrive in the worst possible way. The morning of the reading of the will, Claire Harrison arrived early. She sat alone in the small waiting area outside Daniel Brooks's office, still wearing the black dress she had worn to the cemetery the day before. Her coat was folded neatly across her lap. She held a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. The building hummed with the sound of ventilation and the distant ringing of a phone. No one answered. She was 42 years old, and she looked older than that. Not in the way of someone who had been careless with herself, but in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. When the rest of the family arrived, the room filled quickly with the particular tension that grief and money create when they arrive in the same place at the same time. Ethan Harrison, 39, came in with his hands in his jacket pockets and his jaw already set. He had driven 2 hours from Portland, and he had spent most of that drive preparing himself to be disappointed. He was the youngest of the three, and he had spent the better part of his adult life believing that his father had loved Claire more than he loved him. He had no evidence for this exactly. It was more of a posture, a way of organizing his resentments. Megan Harrison, 36, arrived with red-rimmed eyes and a tissue pressed into her palm. She had been crying on and off since Thursday when the hospice nurse had called. She was the most openly emotional of the three, and grief was moving through her, the way a storm moves through a narrow valley, loudly with nowhere to go. Several cousins filed in behind them, along with Robert's sister Patricia and her husband, and 2 men from the accounting firm that had handled Harrison Manufacturing for decades. The room was not large enough for all of them, but no one suggested moving. Daniel Brooks entered last, carrying a leather folder and wearing an expression Claire recognized as carefully neutral. He greeted everyone with the quiet precision of a man who had been trained to deliver difficult information without becoming part of it. He sat down. He opened the folder. He began to read. The estate was substantial. Several $1 million in liquid assets. The family home in West Portland, a 4-bedroom craftsman their mother had filled with plants before she died. Investment accounts. A minority stake in Harrison Manufacturing, which had been restructured 7 years ago. The vacation cottage on the Oregon coast, that all 3 of them associated with summer, and their father's rare, complete happiness. Daniel read through the schedule of assets in a steady voice, and the room listened the way people listen to things they have already imagined. Then he reached the section on distribution. He paused. Before he could continue, Claire put her hand flat on the table. Gently, no drama. She slid the stapled packet of inheritance documents back across the table toward Daniel. I don't want any of it, she said. The room went still in the way rooms go still before something breaks. Then, before anyone could fill the silence, she said, no one should accept a single dollar for the next 30 days, not the property, not the accounts, nothing. Ethan's chair scraped back against the floor so hard the woman beside him flinched. What are you doing? He said. His voice was low but not quiet. Megan looked at her sister the way a person looks at a stranger they thought they recognized. Her tissue crumpled in her hand. 3 cousins began talking at once. Patricia put her hand on her husband's arm. The 2 accountants exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation. Daniel Brooks said nothing. He closed the folder. His expression did not change. Claire looked at her brother. She looked at her sister. She looked at the room full of people who loved her father, and who were in this moment looking at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to cold accusation. If you love Dad, she said, please trust me. Then she picked up her coat, stood and walked out. No raised voice, no tears, no explanation. The door clicked shut behind her, and the room erupted. What the family believed about Claire Harrison had always been complicated by the fact that she rarely gave them new information to work with. She had been the eldest. She had been from a very young age the one who handled things. When their mother got sick the first time, Claire had been 19, and she had learned more about insurance billing and home care schedules in 4 months than most people learn in a lifetime. She had done it without complaining and without asking for recognition. She had also done it in a way that left her siblings feeling vaguely managed, their own grief organized into the margins of Claire's efficiency. Robert had trusted her. That much was obvious to everyone. He had called her when he needed to think through hard decisions. He had given her access to his financial accounts years before he got sick. For practical reasons he had explained. But that Ethan and Megan had each privately experienced as a slight. She was not warm in the obvious ways. She did not text her siblings on their birthdays without prompting. She had not attended Megan's engagement party because she had been in Sacramento dealing with a legal matter she would not explain. She had canceled 3 Christmases in the last decade each time, with a clean, unapologetic apology that somehow made things worse. People who did not know her well thought she was cold. People who knew her moderately well thought she was controlling. The people who knew her best, and there were very few of them, understood that she operated on a frequency most others could not hear. She noticed things. She kept things. She was the kind of person who wrote down the names of every doctor who had ever treated her mother and sent each of them a handwritten note when the woman finally died. But the family at the table that morning did not have access to any of that. What they had was a dead father, a sealed folder, and a sister who had just refused a fortune and told them to wait 30 days without a single word of explanation. In the absence of explanation, they constructed one. By the evening of the same day, Ethan Harrison had spoken to 4 people and formed a theory. He told it to his wife, a patient woman named Renee, who had developed over 16 years of marriage a careful way of asking questions that slowed him down without stopping him. He told it to his closest friend. He told it in pieces to Megan on a phone call that lasted 47 minutes. The theory was this: Claire had found something in their father's papers. Something that, if the estate were distributed, normally would be difficult for her to control. She had gotten there first to the study to the files, and she had taken what she needed, and now she was stalling the process while she figured out what to do with it. It was not an entirely unreasonable theory. It was constructed from real materials, from the fact that Claire had arrived at the family home the morning after the death and spent 4 hours in Robert's study before anyone else got there. From the fact that she had left with 2 locked document boxes and refused to say what was in them. From the fact that she had apparently known about the meeting with Daniel Brooks before the formal notification had gone out. Ethan hired a private investigator before the week was out. His name was Gary Hollins, and he was thorough and unobtrusive, and he began following Claire's movements almost immediately. What Gary Hollins found did not confirm the theory, but it did not at first dispel it either. Claire's days, as observed by Gary Hollins over the following 2 weeks, were structured and repetitive in a way that suggested obligation rather than pleasure. On Monday and Thursday mornings, she drove to a nursing home on the east side of the city. She always parked in the same spot. She stayed between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. She carried a canvas bag with what appeared to be books and a thermos. She never stopped at the gift shop. She always spoke briefly to the same nurse at the front desk. On Tuesday afternoons, she visited a small law office in a converted Victorian on Burnside. The name on the door was Elaine Marsh Elder Law and Estate Planning. Claire was usually the only client in the waiting room. Her visits averaged an hour. On Friday mornings, she drove to an archive storage facility near the warehouse district and spent between 2 and 3 hours inside. She never carried anything out. She arrived with the locked document boxes twice in the first 10 days and appeared to leave them there. She never went to a bank. She never met with any known financial advisors. She never visited Harrison Manufacturing. She also, Gary Hollins, noted paid for gas with cash, ate lunch at a diner near the archive, where she ordered the same thing each time, and stopped once a week at a pharmacy where she picked up a prescription in someone else's name. He reported all of this to Ethan without analysis. Ethan absorbed it and generated the analysis himself, and because he was looking for confirmation of something, he already believed he found it. The nursing home, someone she was supporting financially. The law office, not their family lawyer, a different one. The archive, where she was apparently storing documents that were part of the estate. He brought this to Megan. She listened with the alert, slightly stunned expression of someone hearing a story that confirmed things they had suspected for years. "She's been hiding a whole other life," Megan said. "There's probably someone, maybe a child, or someone Dad supported secretly, and she's making sure they get something before we do." It wasn't true. Not a single part of it was true. But they had built it from real pieces, and they believed it the way people believe things they have assembled themselves. The person at the nursing home was a man named Harold Kemp. He was 78 years old. He had worked for Harrison Manufacturing for 31 years, starting in the fabrication division in the early 1980s and retiring as floor supervisor in 2014. He had a mild form of dementia and a daughter in Sacramento he spoke to every Sunday. He could not always remember what day it was, but he could remember every person he had ever worked with. And he remembered Robert Harrison with the precise, uncomplicated warmth of a man who had been treated fairly for 3 decades. Claire had been visiting Harold for 2 years. She brought him novels because his daughter had told her he loved to be read to. She brought the thermos because the nursing home coffee was terrible, and Harold had very strong opinions about coffee. She had not told her siblings about Harold, or about the 11 other former Harrison employees she visited, checked in on, or quietly assisted. She had not told them because it was not their business, and because her father had asked her not to discuss the company's obligations with anyone, and because she had come to believe over many years that some acts of care were diminished by being spoken about. The prescription at the pharmacy was for a woman named Sandra Ortiz, who had been Robert Harrison's executive assistant for 22 years and who was now recovering from hip replacement surgery. Sandra did not have adequate prescription coverage. Robert had known this would eventually be a problem. Claire had been managing it since October. None of this was secret in the conspiratorial sense. It was simply private. There is a difference, though, in the absence of information. The difference is difficult to see. Victor Lang first appeared at the Harrison family home on the 9th day after the funeral. He came with a bottle of wine and an expression of measured sympathy, and he introduced himself to Ethan as a financial consultant who had worked periodically with Robert over the last several years. He was 61 trim, dressed in the specific way of men who have decided that wealth should look quiet. He had an easy smile and a careful way of listening that made people feel he was the only one in the room who really understood them. He had known about Robert's guarantee. He had known about it for 4 years because his former business partner, a man named Kevin Marsh, who had very nearly destroyed Harrison Manufacturing with a series of leveraged investments that violated the company's bylaws, had told him about it in a conversation that Kevin would not have had if he had understood Victor's capacity for patience. Victor had been waiting. That was the only word for what he had been doing. He had cultivated a peripheral association with the Harrison family over 3 years, mentioning himself to Robert at the right moments, positioning himself as available without being intrusive. He had not planned to move until Robert died, and once Robert died, he needed one thing for the estate to be distributed quickly and impulsively before the legal structures Robert had put in place could be fully examined. He chose Ethan. Not because Ethan was weak exactly, because Ethan was in pain and he was angry, and those two things together made him willing to move fast. Victor spent the 9th through the 20th day of the 30-day period becoming Ethan's closest confidant on matters of the estate. He did this without saying anything explicitly false. He asked questions. He reflected concerns back. He gently introduced the idea that delay benefited Claire, and that Claire's refusal to explain herself was itself a kind of evidence. "Your father worked his entire life to build something for his family," Victor told Ethan one evening, sitting in the living room of the family home with the glass of the wine he had brought. Whatever Claire thinks she's protecting, and I'm sure she has her reasons, you and Megan have a right to understand exactly what's at stake before this stretches any further. It was perfectly calibrated. It contained not one explicit lie. It was designed to move Ethan toward a legal challenge of the estate, which would trigger a rapid court-supervised distribution, which would create the opening Victor needed to acquire key Harrison manufacturing assets at a discounted valuation before the company's pension guarantee could be formally verified and enforced. He was very good at what he did. The guarantee itself had been put in place 11 years earlier, during the worst 14 months in the company's history. Kevin Marsh had been Robert's partner for 9 years before the crisis. They had built Harrison Manufacturing together, divided responsibility. Cleanly, Robert ran operations, Kevin handled finance and investor relations, and for most of those 9 years, it had worked. Kevin was brilliant and restless, and as it turned out, willing to take risks with other people's money that he would never have taken with his own. The leverage positions he built without Robert's knowledge in 2012 and 2013 were not illegal precisely, but they were a profound violation of the partnership agreement. And when they collapsed, they very nearly took 400 jobs with them. Robert found out in February of 2014 in a conversation with the company's external auditor that began as a routine review and ended with Robert sitting alone in his car in the parking garage for 45 minutes, unable to move. He restructured the company within 6 months. He bought Kevin out under terms that legally were more than fair, and that Robert found personally excruciating. He secured new financing. He stabilized operations. He saved the jobs. But in the process of stabilizing the company, the pension fund for the company's longest-serving employees, a defined benefit structure that covered 63 retirees, had been placed in temporary jeopardy. The restructuring resolved most of it. The residual gap, covering 17 people whose benefits were technically unsecured during the transition, was addressed by Robert personally. He signed a personal guarantee. He told no one except Daniel Brooks and Claire. If something happens to me before this is fully wound down, he told Daniel, the guarantee lives in my estate. The estate has to be managed carefully for at least 30 days after my death to make sure the legal structure holds. If anyone distributes assets before that window closes, the guarantee could be challenged. Those people lose their pensions. Daniel had told him to document it more formally. Robert had said he would. He had not, because Robert Harrison solved problems intensely and then moved forward, and formalization felt to him like admitting that the problem was not yet solved. What he had done instead was tell Claire. He told her on a Sunday afternoon in October, 14 months before he died. They were sitting on the back porch of the family home. The leaves were down. He had been formally diagnosed 3 weeks earlier, and he was in the phase of illness, where everything that had been deferred was suddenly pressing. He told her the full story. Kevin Marsh's betrayal, the restructuring, the guarantee, the 17 retirees, the legal vulnerability that would exist in the window after his death if anyone moved impulsively with the estate. He told her that he had spoken to Daniel about the 30-day window. He told her that Victor Lang, an associate of Kevin Marsh's, who had been appearing in his peripheral vision with increasing frequency, was someone she should watch. "I'm sorry to put this on you," he said. "You're not putting it on me," Claire said. "You're trusting me with it." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she would not be able to fully describe, later even to her husband. "The box is in the study," he said. "Everything you need is in there. I've written it all down. There's also a letter. Give it to Daniel. He'll know when to open it." She took the boxes home that night. She had been carrying the weight of what was inside them for 14 months. The family intervention happened on the 19th day. It had been organized in the way family things are sometimes organized, with a specific structure that collapsed almost immediately. Ethan had wanted to do it at the family home. Megan had agreed. 3 cousins had been asked to be present as witnesses. Victor Lang had strongly suggested it, in the careful way he suggested things. They gathered in the living room at 7 in the evening. Claire arrived, knowing what was coming. Her husband, Michael, a quiet, methodical man, who had been married to her for 14 years and had learned to trust her judgment, even when it frightened him, had driven her there and was waiting in the car. Ethan spoke first. He went through the list of things that had troubled him: her refusal at the reading, her silence about the document boxes, the visits to the nursing home, the law office, the archive. He was not shouting. He was worse than shouting. He was deliberate, measured, and clearly certain. Megan followed. Her voice broke twice. She said that she felt like she had lost not just her father, but the idea of her family, and that Claire had something to do with that, and she needed to understand why. Patricia, their father's sister, said that she had known Robert for 61 years, and she could not believe he would have wanted this. Each one of them was expressing something real. Each one of them was expressing it in the wrong direction toward the wrong person, for reasons that felt right but weren't. Claire sat with her hands folded. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not explain. Michael had asked her in the car why she couldn't just tell them. "Because Dad trusted me," she had said. Not to protect a secret, to protect a promise. There is a version of that conversation where Michael understood immediately. That was not the version they had. He understood with his mind, but not with his heart. And by the time they pulled up to the family home, he was afraid for their marriage, in a way he had not been afraid of anything in years. She had walked into that house knowing she might lose everything before it was over. She sat in the intervention and said almost nothing. When the room finally exhausted itself, when Ethan's certainty had spent itself against her silence, and Megan's grief had subsided into hiccuping exhaustion, Claire stood. 11 more days, she said, and she left. The legal challenge came on day 23. Ethan, on Victor's quiet recommendation, hired an attorney named Conrad Willis to file a motion challenging the estate's administration delay. The argument was procedural. No legitimate legal rationale had been provided for the 30-day hold, and the estate's beneficiaries were suffering undue delay and emotional harm. It was a reasonable argument technically. Conrad Willis was a competent attorney. The motion was filed correctly, and it moved quickly through the docket. Daniel Brooks received the notification on a Thursday morning and spent 4 hours on the phone, first with his own attorney, then with the elder law consultant he had worked with on the guarantee documentation, then with Claire. The conversation with Claire was the shortest. "Can you hold it?" she asked. "For how long?" 7 days. He could hold it for 5. The 5 days that followed were the quietest and the most dangerous. Victor Lang understood through sources he had cultivated carefully over years that the legal motion was in play. He understood that the 5-day delay gave Claire or whoever she was working with a narrow window. He accelerated his own preparations. He had 2 potential buyers for Harrison Manufacturing assets, already lined up, positioned as investors interested in the company's real estate holdings. The legal mechanism he intended to exploit was a clause in the restructuring agreement that allowed creditors to initiate asset valuation proceedings if the company's pension guarantee was found to be insufficiently collateralized. It was a narrow crack in the legal structure. He had been studying it for 4 years. He needed confusion speed and an emotionally destabilized family to make it work. What he did not account for was the sealed package in Daniel Brooks's desk drawer. On the morning of day 28, Daniel Brooks called the family together, not in the conference room of his office, in the family home's living room where Robert Harrison had built a fire every winter evening for 30 years. Daniel had requested that Claire be present. He had also requested that Ethan and Megan bring no one else. Victor Lang had been planning to attend until Daniel's assistant told him politely, and with no particular emphasis, that the meeting was family only. Victor waited. He was good at waiting. He waited for 6 hours before he understood that something had gone wrong. Daniel set the leather folder on the coffee table. Beside it, he placed a sealed envelope and a USB drive. "Your father left instructions." He said that this package was to be opened on day 28 or earlier if legal proceedings were initiated against the estate. The challenge Ethan filed qualified. He looked at Ethan when he said it. Ethan looked at his hands. Daniel plugged the USB drive into the small laptop he had brought. He turned the screen so all 3 of them could see. Robert Harrison's face appeared. He was sitting in his study at his desk in front of the window, where the light came in from the garden. He was thinner than they remembered him, already carrying the weight of what was coming, but his eyes were clear, and his voice was steady. He spoke for 17 minutes. He explained Kevin Marsh. He explained the restructuring. He explained the guarantee in the specific, precise terms of a man who had spent his professional life turning complicated problems into clear language. He named the 17 retirees. He named Harold Kemp. He named Sandra Ortiz and 6 others whose lives were tied to the promise he had made. He explained why he had asked Claire to do what she had done. She is going to be called selfish, he said. She is going to be called controlling. She may be accused of things I cannot predict. I know her well enough to know she will not defend herself at the cost of protecting this. I am sorry for what I am asking her to carry. He paused. The light from the garden moved across his face. But I trusted her, because she understands that some promises are more important than being understood. He looked directly into the camera. Ethan, Megan, whatever you have thought about your sister in the last 28 days, let it go. She was protecting you. She was protecting people who had nothing to do with our family, and who deserved to be protected. She was being exactly the person I raised her to be, even though I raised her to be that person in private, at a cost I did not have to pay. The recording ended. The room was completely silent. Daniel opened the sealed envelope. Inside were the original guarantee documents, the legal opinion he had obtained in the months after Robert's diagnosis, confirming the estate's liability, and a set of documented communications between Victor Lang and Kevin Marsh spanning the previous 3 years. An independent forensic accounting firm had been engaged by Daniel on Robert's instructions 6 months before his death. Their final report, delivered the previous week, documented Victor's strategy in precise detail. The leverage acquisition plan, the targeted assets, the legal mechanism, and the coordinated timing that depended entirely on rapid estate distribution. Conrad Willis, Ethan's attorney, received a copy of the report by secure courier that morning. His client had been used. The legal challenge was withdrawn by noon. Victor Lang's phone calls went unanswered. His 2 potential buyers, upon review of the documentation, declined to proceed. The legal mechanism he had intended to exploit was rendered moot by the estate's proper handling of the guarantee window. He was not charged with a crime because he had not committed one technically. What he had done was position himself opportunistically inside a family's grief and aim a carefully constructed deception at their most vulnerable moment. The facts laid out cleanly and completely were sufficient. He left the city before the week was over. Ethan was the first to speak after Daniel closed the folder. He did not speak for a long time. He was doing something internal that Claire recognized, because she had seen him do it since he was a child, rebuilding a structure he had built wrong piece by piece, in the particular silence of a person who is too honest with himself to pretend he can do it quickly. He remembered the morning of their mother's first hospitalization, when Claire had driven 4 hours to be there, because he had called her at 2 a.m, and she had simply said, "I'm coming," without asking why. He remembered the year he had lost his job, and she had deposited money in his account, without telling him, and without expecting to be paid back. He remembered the way she sat beside their father in the last weeks, not talking, not managing, just present in the quiet way that was her truest form of love. Every memory was a door opening on a room he had sealed wrong. He reached into the folder and took out the inheritance documents, the ones Claire had pushed back across the table 28 days ago. He walked across the room and held them out to her. She looked at them for a moment. She shook her head very slightly. He sat down beside her instead and put the papers on the table between them, and they sat together in the way siblings sit when they are learning again how to be in the same room. Megan cried, not the way she had been crying for a month, not the sharp, agitated grief of someone who does not know where to direct their pain. She cried the specific way of someone who has been wrong about something important and is feeling the full weight of it for the first time. She had stopped seeing Claire as a sister years ago. She had seen her as a function a force, a presence that organized and managed and did not need what other people needed. She had built that version of Claire carefully, without meaning to, from the materials that were easiest to reach: the canceled Christmases, the unapologetic apologies, the silence in rooms where someone else would have spoken. She had never asked herself what the silence cost. She crossed the room. She did not say the right thing because there was no right thing. She just said Claire's name, and then she didn't say anything else, and Claire put both arms around her and held on, and for a long time, neither of them moved. Daniel watched all of this from his chair by the window. When the room had settled, he reached once more into the bag he had brought and removed a small, worn leather notebook. He crossed to Claire and placed it in her hands. She turned it over. She recognized it, the brown leather, the worn spine, the small brass clasp that Robert had always carried in the breast pocket of his winter coat. She had seen it her entire life, without ever knowing what was in it. She opened it. The first page held a single handwritten sentence in her father's careful, narrow script. The strongest person in a family is usually the one willing to be misunderstood. She read it twice. Then she pressed the notebook closed and held it against her chest, and she looked out the window at the garden, where the light was the same color it had been in the recording, and she smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since the funeral. The legal matters resolved cleanly in the days that followed. The guarantee was formally executed and secured against the estate within the window Robert had specified. The 17 retirees retained full pension protection. Harrison Manufacturing fulfilled the final obligation Robert had put in place, and the company, now managed by its operations board under a restructured arrangement, emerged from the episode with its integrity intact. The estate was distributed 30 days after the original reading per Robert Harrison's instructions. Claire accepted nothing. She had made that decision years ago, not as a sacrifice, but as a form of clarity. She did not need the money. She needed to have been trusted with something harder than money. What she kept was the notebook. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in early spring, the Harrison Manufacturing retirees gathered for a luncheon at a community center in East Portland. It had been organized, quietly funded by a discretionary account in the restructured company budget at a suggestion Claire had made to the board. There were no speeches about wealth. There was no formal program. There were long tables covered with white paper cloths, and platters of food that people brought themselves, and a room full of men and women in their 60s and 70s and 80s, who had worked long careers and honest jobs, and who had in the last 3 months understood more fully than before what had almost happened to them. Harold Kemp was there in a wheelchair with his daughter, who had flown in from Sacramento. He could not always remember what day it was, but he remembered Robert Harrison's name, and when Claire sat beside him, he took her hand and held it without saying anything, and that was enough. Ethan and Megan came together. They arrived a few minutes late, stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room, and then Ethan spotted Claire and walked toward her, and Megan followed, and the three of them stood together in the way they had not stood together in years, without argument, without management, without the old architecture of grievance between them. The room was loud with ordinary conversation. People passed food. Children ran between tables. Someone had brought a dessert that everyone agreed was the best thing they had ever eaten, and no one could agree on what it was. Michael found Claire near the window, watching the room. "How are you?" he asked. She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about all questions. "I'm all right," she said. "I think I'm actually all right." He took her hand. She leaned slightly toward him, and they stood there together while the room continued around them. Later that afternoon, after the luncheon had wound down and the tables were being cleared, Claire drove to the family office. The building had been there since the company's early years, a 2-story brick structure on Morrison Street that Robert had always refused to move out of, even when the company grew large enough to justify a newer address. He had said the building remembered things. Claire had thought it was a strange thing to say. She had come to understand it. She let herself in with the key she had carried for 15 years. The office was quiet and smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic that was particular to the building, and that Claire associated in a way she could not entirely explain with her father's presence. She walked to the desk in the back room. She sat down. She placed the leather notebook in the center of the desk, opened it to the first page, and read the sentence one more time. Then she closed it gently and slid it into the center drawer. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Outside, the light was doing what spring light does in Portland, arriving at an angle that made ordinary things look briefly luminous. It came through the west window and lay across the desk in a pale rectangle. Claire Harrison sat in her father's chair in her father's office and did not move for a long time. She was not waiting for anything. She was not planning anything. She was simply present in a place where her father had kept his word for 30 years, and she had kept it for him, when he could no longer keep it himself, and the keeping of it had cost her things that she had been willing to pay. She had not done it for recognition. She had not done it to be understood or thanked or restored. She had done it because her father had trusted her with something that mattered more than her reputation, more than her inheritance, more than her siblings' approval, or her family's comfort, or her own peace of mind during the hardest month of her life. He had trusted her with a promise made to people who had worked hard and expected nothing extraordinary from life except to have what they had earned. He had trusted her with the understanding that some things cannot be explained in the moment they are most needed, and that love sometimes looks nothing like love at all, until the right moment when it looks like exactly what it always was. She had carried it. She had held. That in the end was the whole of the inheritance that mattered, not the fortune her father left behind, but the burden he trusted only one person to carry, and the quiet, unwavering courage it takes to carry it, even when everyone you love mistakes love for betrayal.